Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be back in Abu Dhabi. So, I'm talking today, that's better. I'm talking today about anti-fragility, and it's quite an interesting question. This Congress is, of course, about organisational excellence, but it's up to you to think about this, but does organisational excellence include anti-fragility, or does anti-fragility include organisational excellence? Anti-fragility seems a strange terminology. Is it anything new? What's the concept? Is it of interest to the organisational excellence community? They're the sorts of questions which I hope you'll get answers to by the end of the presentation. Now, it is also something which is quite embedded in the anti-fragile idea that we ourselves, people, have this property. The concept of anti-fragility is due to an American Lebanese called Nassim Taleb, who was the man who made an awful amount of money out of the financial crisis, a trader on the New York Stock Exchange who predicted the crisis, gambled on the crisis, and made a lot of money, and then left full-time trading and became a professor in New York University. He published a book called The Black Swan, which became a bestseller around the world, and a few years later he published a book called Anti-Fragile, which established the concept. My interest in this is that I can see how this links to organisational excellence, and that's what I want to talk about today. And my own book, in fact, is on that topic. Now, most people, if asked what's the opposite of fragile, will probably say robust or resilient. If something isn't fragile, it's robust. But robustness does not have all the properties of the opposite of fragility. Something that's fragile fails easily. It doesn't withstand stress. That's true of equipment, it's true of systems, and indeed is true of people. Something that's robust can withstand stress up to a limit. But there's another property which we have as people, which all natural systems have, which is the ability to get stronger by being stressed. So when I exercise within limits, I get stronger. Now, the way we've thought about systems until this point has been more about robustness than about anti-fragility. We think of strong systems that won't fail. We think of resilience. We place redundancy in systems. But what we don't think about is the property which we see in biological organisms, which we see in natural systems, which is the ability to grow in strength from exposure to the environment. And the idea of anti-fragility is about that, the property of getting stronger through being stressed. Now, this is a very timely issue because we are seeing more failures of systems and organisations than we have ever seen in human history. The rate at which these are occurring appears to be getting greater and quicker. So it is pretty obvious that conventional management thinking, including organisational excellence, is not delivering on protecting us from these failures. The fragility is associated with many things. It's associated with the volatile environment in which we live now. It's associated with the weaknesses in our systems and processes. It's associated with human factors in governance and in management. And it's also associated with the rush to efficiency, the rush to leanness. And if you think about it, the more efficient a system is, generally, the more fragile it is. If you look at the curve on the center of that slide, you can see a curve which shows the relationship between fragility and efficiency. At very, very low efficiency in systems, typically we are quite fragile, but also very much at very high efficiency, we are very, very fragile. So an appointment system with no gaps is likely to fail. The problems at Heathrow Airport. High efficiency often implies high fragility, and therefore a rush for efficiency without any consideration of other factors can be very much associated with the failure of our systems. Failure. I used to update this slide a lot. I've given up. There's just too much bad news all the time. The evidence of failure of systems, of course, very, very big in the financial crisis, but all the time we are seeing iconic organizations ceasing to trade. We're seeing major systems within organizations fail. And somehow or other, when we talk about organizational excellence, we don't talk about this. We take for granted, it seems, when we assess against the EFQM excellence model or Baldrige or any of the models, we take for granted that implicitly, somehow, if we meet the criteria of those models, we're going to be resilient, or at least robust. But nowhere in those models do we have very explicit consideration of the issue of fragility or the growth of a property of anti-fragility, in the current models at least. A quick Google of high-profile organizational failures gives you more than 5 million results, indicative of the problem that we face. Not just system failures now, but organizational failures. Failures so big that in many cases the organization ceases to exist or has to be completely rethought. And the evidence is it's getting worse. Richard Foster, who's professor at Yale University, in looking at the Standard & Poor's index, realized that the average lifespan of a company on the index is shorter now than it ever has been before, decreasing from 67 years in the 1920s to just 15 years today. So being in the top 500 companies in the world is going to be for less time than ever before. The prediction is that by 2020, more than 3/4 of the Standard & Poor 500 will be companies that have not yet been heard of. And there's no proof that age makes a company more profitable than younger companies either. If we only made up the index of companies which were part of it in 1957, we would have much worse performance. So we get lots of causes of failure. The immediate causes of failure are massive. They include changing markets, simple insolvency, corporate crime, inability to adapt and to reinvent themselves, but that we're getting more and more failure. So how do we protect ourselves against this? The classic model would say that we use risk management. We look at the risk, particularly at the highest level. We look at enterprise risk management. But there's problems in risk management in the way it's currently constructed. if you look at ISO 31000, the risk management standard, you will realize that the nature of risk management is by its nature reactive. The idea is that we wish to achieve objectives in the business, risk is the chance that we don't achieve them, and in order to be able to include a risk in a risk analysis, you have to be able to conceive it. You have to be able to think about it. You have to be able to recognize that it may be a risk. And the failures of those organizations provide the evidence that when organizations do fail today, they're usually non-predictable risks. What's being called black swans. A risk which never made it into the risk analysis. A risk that was seen as being so rare, so unlikely, it wasn't even considered. That's what's killing our organizations. Now, risk analysis also has other deficiencies. It needs information flow. Very often in reality, the process is an annual review process which doesn't keep up with what's happening in the external world. It assumes that we've got management attention and full information, none of which is typically true to the risk department. These black swans are rare, high-impact, unpredictable events. We don't have much theory about these as yet. We're still trying to make sense of these. But the black swan is a good example. When black swans were discovered in Australia, it was a massive event that completely got us to rethink biology. We had no way of predicting it. It wasn't expected. Now, since the financial crisis, most organizations, and many in the region here, are using enterprise risk management. We've taken risk management and we've taken it up to the level of the board. We've tried to bring together the risk silos from the various parts of the business into one risk analysis that looks at all the risks that the organization is susceptible to, but it's still suffering from all the problems of risk management. For instance, if we can't conceive the risk, it's not in the risk analysis. So the biggest threats, the ones that have proved not to be in the risk analysis, the biggest threats are ignored by this approach. Our solution has been, until this point, to try and make our systems robust. Because our systems fail, we try and have weaknesses, we try and have safeguards to prevent those weaknesses getting through. Unfortunately, that very often makes our systems very rigid, very control-orientated, very restrictive, but at the same time doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Let me give you an example of the problem with robustness. This is the Thames Barrier. This is what protects London from flooding. If the Thames Barrier is breached, we lose a third of London, the low-lying parts of London, which has got more than a third of the population associated with it. It's a serious risk. We're always worried about how big it is and how strong it is. But of course, the problem with robustness is always exactly that. However robust it is, we're always waiting for something bigger or stronger to go beyond it. There's no practical level of robustness or resilience that's strong enough. It can reduce the risk, but that's all it can do. And also, robust systems don't themselves get better. There's even evidence to suggest they get worse. They're not very popular. We have now got a whole industry in forensic accounting, looking at why it went wrong and how we try and capture it and how we stop it from absolute disaster. But the problem with that is a bit too late. It's after the failure. It's not an adequate way of dealing with the situation. It's the tip of the iceberg. And the problem also is if we look at where fragility exists in our organisations, that it exists at all levels. So on the right is the Deloitte's layer model. It's a good model for looking at an organisation in terms of the easy to change things, like the customer segments, through to the hard to change thing, like the infrastructure and the location. And of course, fragility in our organisations exists at every single level, from the strategy and the governance of the organisation, where because governance depends on people, we have inherent fragility, through the operations, the processes, and particularly the supply chain, because supply chains crossing national and geographic boundaries tend to be particularly at risk and fragile, through the people and culture, which keeps the organisation running, but where fragility can easily exist, particularly in new circumstances, through the information and technology, where we're seeing increasing fragility taking place, through the markets, the products and services, where change in the market makes the organisation fragile. We've got fragility everywhere at all levels. And, of course, we've got global and local fragility. We try and trade off local fragility for global. We store information in the cloud, we reduce local fragility, but if the whole system goes down, we have massive global fragility now. One of the interesting things about anti-fragility, although it was Nassim Taleb who created the concept, is we always had it. It was always there. It was in us. The cat is pretty anti-fragile. The whole concept, if you like, of why we think of cats with 9 lives is about that ability to adapt and to respond. It can drop from a great height, from 10 times its own height, and it won't be damaged. Natural systems are typically anti-fragile. They have the ability to restore themselves. Just as, to an extent, we have, our bodies have. Until now, though, the models for dealing with protection in organisations have been mechanical models based on robustness, rather than natural models based on characteristics of natural systems. And of course, organisations are a mixture between a natural system and a man-made system. In an organisation, we have structure and procedures, which is man-made and rule-based, but we also have the ability, the motivation, the culture, which is very much part of a natural system. Well, our models have been very much focused on the mechanical aspects, the robustness, the resilience, rather than this growth aspect which is associated with anti-fragile. Over on the left-hand side of this slide, you've got the characters in mythology which perhaps connect. The sword of Damocles is a good example of fragility. The phoenix, which in fact comes back after the fire, is a good example, perhaps, of robustness. But the ultimate example of anti-fragility is the hydra, which, in fact, grows extra heads. For every head you cut off, it grows 10. This property of getting stronger from being stressed. Interestingly, that it was there in early culture, this concept of anti-fragility. Now, if you look at sources of anti-fragility in organisations, there are a number of these, of course. Learning, where we learn and where we apply that learning, the organisation, in fact, grows in strength. Where we are very aware of our environment and internal conditions, it grows in strength. Where our information systems are good, where we can make fast decisions well with due diligence, where we're flexible and agile, where we share risk away from the organisation. And if we can build in these features, our organisational governance, our strategy, our structure and systems, our peoples, our partnerships, our culture will define the level of anti-fragility or fragility in our organisation. Of course, different systems will have different levels of fragility and anti-fragility. And then we can build anti-fragility or fragility into our products and services. Systems such as the EFQM or the ISO standards are good examples of anti-fragile systems because they're safeguarding systems. They exist to provide a check, a verification. They're based on learning about what can go wrong, and they're supposed to be proportional to risk. There is, however, a problem with these systems in the way they're often implemented, and particularly in the region, in that they're often implemented in a very rigid way. They're very rule-based. They get no management attention. And so, whilst they're themselves, they are anti-fragile, they're actually implemented in a fragile way. So these safeguarding systems have second-level fragility. The system itself provides some anti-fragility, but the anti-fragile system is itself fragile. The delegation to middle management, the lack of attention, the formalisation and standardisation takes them often into a compliance-driven ritual. And that makes it a fragile characteristic rather than an anti-fragile one. People, of course, as we talked about, are very much anti-fragile. People have got the ability to step outside of systems if they're not overly controlled. They can compensate, they can capture things. But it's how we manage them which is going to have an impact on whether this is effective or not. It's our culture in the organisation is going to have an effect on this. The interesting thing is that we haven't looked as organisations at the minimisation of fragility as a whole across the organisation. And how can we talk about organisational excellence if we don't? How can you be an excellent organisation if you haven't got a view of managing the fragilities in your organisation and the growth in strength? So, 10 pitfalls of fragile organisations. Number one, and unfortunately the one that's associated with most of the organisational failures we have seen recently, they don't know they're fragile. They haven't got that level of awareness. Number two, not being joined up. The parts of the organisation don't communicate well, don't interface well with other parts. It's a silo-based organisation. Number three, they know they're fragile, but they don't do anything about it. Knowing but not doing. Many organisations, unfortunately, like that. Number four, doing risk management as a compliance-driven ritual. Number five, short-term, money, emphasis. Now, fragility and anti-fragility are about the long term. They're about the survival of the organisation. If you focus, obviously, on short-termism and the annual budget cycle, you increase the fragility. Number six, the bureaucracy that gets in the way of the signals and the information, and the emphasis on control as opposed to growth, learning, agility. Number seven, badly managing change. Change is about responding to external environment and conditions, taking advantage of opportunities, avoiding issues. But if you manage it badly, it's a source of fragility. Weak processes or an emphasis on initiatives So it's all about initiatives. It's not about the organisation. We count initiatives. Number 9, non-transparent decision making. The less transparency there is, the less clarity there is, the more risk there is, partly through the governance area, but also sensibly through operations as well. And finally, the last one about the supply network, the supply chain. The whole of that chain is a very fragile part of the organisation because it crosses organisational boundaries, it crosses national boundaries and geographic boundaries, so we tend to have a lot of weakness there. And also increasingly with technology, we're seeing a rush away from customers. We're reducing that front end where we get to the ultimate customer, the ultimate client. And so again, this tends to be another aspect of the fragility that we see. So here's a very basic fragility test for you to try in your head. 10 questions and a 10-point scale on each. How good is our current approach? How robust do you think we really are, or indeed anti-fragile? How much are we really considering it? Do we deliberately include diversity of approach and deployment? One of the great methods of achieving anti-fragility is diversity. If you look at natural systems, they achieve this, of course, in every generation by throwing up diversity. And so we see the survival of species, even though we see the failures of individuals. So one of the ways that nature achieves anti-fragility is through diversity. Awareness of the environment, the ability to learn from our circumstances, and to learn at speed, and to apply what we learn, and to evolve. And then the interesting one about how optimized are our processes. Remember, the more optimized our processes are, beyond a certain point, we probably are causing fragility within our processes. A highly optimized process will fail more often, other things being considered. So organizations can become more anti-fragile. Anti-fragile is not a state you reach, it's a journey in each of the different dimensions of the organization. We talked about the layers in the layer model. In each of those, in all the places, in all the areas, in all the functions, we can move towards becoming more anti-fragile. The starting point, of course, is to don't think you're there. To realize you never completely get there, but you're never completely not there. We've got some aspects of anti-fragility naturally in all organizations because we have a human element. To be aware, to scan the external and internal environment, to look at risks and scenarios and possible black swans. To be joined up and nimble, to keep learning and apply. To avoid rigidity, ultra-efficiency, and relying on robustness. Not to automate, but to engage. Trouble with automation is it takes away that human feature, which is the anti-fragile feature. So we need to retain some engagement around the process. To reduce the fragility of the anti-fragile system, so the anti-fragile systems such as the ISO systems or the use of the excellence model, very good as long as they're not rigidly applied, that there's learning in them and adaptation. Use diversity. Apply precautionary principles. One of the things we learnt from areas like environmental management is there's some things you should never do. We don't know, for instance, if we think of the next pandemic we've got, we don't know what it's going to be, but we do know that basic hygiene remains a good idea. So some precautionary principles in organisations are a very, very good idea. Taleb himself talked about skin in the game, the idea that we never have board members who don't at least partially own the organisation, so they've got something at risk, as one of the precautionary principles that we might look at. Fail often and small. Build in failure, expect failure, encourage failure. Because it's by failure that we get the learning. Good judgment comes from experience, but experience comes from bad judgment. And stress test. Now, what's really interesting about this is that as somebody who's taught in business schools for a large proportion of his career, one of the interesting things about the business schools is that almost every discipline claims all the others. So strategy claims to be the unifier. HR claims to be the unifier. Finance claims to be the unifier, but none of them really unify the whole of the model of the organisation. The interesting thing about anti-fragility is that largely it does. It says we have an organisation in which we have got human elements, but we've also got system elements. And if you look at the organisation from an anti-fragile point of view, we've got a very clear model which kind of explains what we want to do in the process areas, in the people areas, in the strategy areas, in the governance areas, etc. It also tells us that a naive focusing on optimising efficiency is wrong. If you get too efficient, you're likely to fail. You're likely not to think of the changes that will affect your system. If you hardwire a very, very efficient, lean system, you can't deal with change in that system at all. You've got conveyor belts, you've got a restrictive system, too difficult to change. If you use a flexible system with multi-skilled people, you can adapt very quickly, very easily. The rush to efficiency gives us fragility. So I would argue that anti-fragility, interestingly enough, unifies and provides both structure around and safeguards in applying excellence, and actually accounts for all of the methods we've been using in quality and areas such as Lean and Six Sigma over the years. They all can be fitted in very nicely to the anti-fragile model, which is what my book's about. Just let's talk about that efficiency optimization thing just for a moment. So if you take the example of a lean system, if we hardwire it, that rigidity means that our system probably hasn't got very long life length. Because going for efficiency, that's the best solution with a simple model of maximizing efficiency. It doesn't take account of the fact that by becoming efficient, it makes us rigid. Another interesting example is tied up with this curve I mentioned before, that as we get towards very high efficiency, we get very high fragility. If we rely on cost as a judgment for decision making, we do an expectation-based costing. It's always an average costing we're working on. One of the things that anti-fragility makes us realize is that fragilities are about extremes, they're not about averages. So that doing any sort of decision-making based on expected values, based on average values, based on likely circumstances, is probably not a good judgment. What we need to be able to deal with is the extremes, that 50-year wave that's going to go over the Thames Barrier. That's what we're concerned with, not the average wave. The average wave is not a threat at all. We'll come to the wrong decision if we focus on the average wave. So, really just to finish, what I'd like to say is that every day organisations unnecessarily fail, and with massive financial and human costs. That's the reality around the world. And if anyone can lead a change in that sort of thinking, it has to be the global organisational excellence community. It's incorrect to assume that's not part of our problem. It is very, very much part of our problem, us as a community. Anti-Fragility provides a language for thinking about that, for addressing that. It makes you realize that efficiency is a dangerous concept, and yet an all-pervasive one in our businesses, increasingly. It provides a unification for our business model, so it's a key message. And I'd like to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tony, for your interesting presentation. And now I'm sure everybody in this room know more about the Anti-Fragile organization at the moment. Now I would like to open the floor for the question. So I would like to invite the Prof. Tony again to come to the stage. If you have any question, please introduce your name and the organization. Thank you.
I'm Kamran Musa from Pakistan, Institute of Quality. Very interesting presentation, and you have given a few new dimensions to look into this issue of fragility. However, I'm a little confused between being proactive and developing a system with risk management system and your anti-fragility management system. The ability to predict is based on the cumulative knowledge of organizations. As we grow in knowledge, we predict the future, or we predict the risk. And the risk management systems basically are based on this issue of identifying risk based on the cumulative knowledge. All the things that you have given to me, I'm a little confused between differentiating between the risk management system and anti-fragility management system, and where is the line to draw, and what additional value you get from what additional process in anti-fragility which is not in the risk management system.
Thank you. Good question. So to repeat the key factor of a risk management system, the first thing you have to be able to do if you're going to do a risk analysis is you have to be able to conceive of the risk. If you don't conceive of the risk, it's not in your risk analysis. Therefore, if you run a risk management system, at best, you've got the risks you can think of. Now, what are the threats to our organizations in a volatile, fast-changing world, a world where we haven't been before? The risks are new. The hazards we're facing are not ones we're conventionally expecting. They're the ones we haven't thought of. If you look through the forensic account of all the failures of risk analysis, and there's been so many, it's amazing. And if you look at the academic literature, and indeed the risk profession's own literature in the field, what you find is that it is always the risks we didn't conceive of, or we didn't rate, which are the ones which are killing our organizations. Now, this connects very strongly to the idea of black swans. So I'll repeat what a black swan is. A black swan is a rare, unpredictable event of high magnitude. So the financial crisis was taken as a black swan. It's a little bit debatable, but it's a good example of a black swan. So the question is, before the financial crisis, did our banks, using risk analysis, take adequate account of the impending financial crisis? We know the answer. The trouble with risk analysis is it's backward-looking in the current form. The way that risk analysis is constructed, the basis of the ISO standard and of the methodology that's used in all sectors, is based on having to know what risks are possible in the first place. If you don't know what risks are possible, it's not in your risk analysis. Now, anti-fragility says that's not what the issue is. It says we have inherent fragilities in our processes. So what we need to do is we need to try and learn more about what's going on, so we might do scenario planning work, etc., to add in. But there are also some good precautionary principles that we should apply in all organisations. I mentioned skin in the game as an example of this. Don't have board directors who don't have skin in the game. The truth is, in risk, we live with risks which we expect as normal. We take for granted, therefore we don't rate them. For example, in most countries now, the biggest likely cause of death is road traffic accidents. But we don't see that as a big threat because our perception of risk is extremely limited. We don't include it in our risk analyses. The idea of anti-fragility is that we're always building a system which is working consistently on looking at where the fragilities are in the organisation, are trying to protect ourselves against those fragilities, even if we don't know what they are. And that's the difference. The precautionary principles, the use of information, etc.